Well, when you're in a casino, the house always wins, right? And my question is, who is the house in this instance? And I think we can rightly say that the primary house is a fossil fuel industry. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this session, Extreme Weather Chaos in Our Climate Casino. We're the Climate Emergency Forum, and we'll be discussing the climate crises of this year, of which there are many. I'm Regina Valdez, and we're going to have Peter virtually. To my right is Paul Beckwith. Thank you so much, Paul. So I know that many of you have been reading the headlines this year, and you're well aware of the many climate crises that we've experienced this year, unprecedented. But I just want to help refresh your memory a bit. This past February, you may recall the incredible flooding in Germany that took everyone by surprise. We saw hundreds of years of historical architecture just wash away right off its foundations. Amazing, something unseen. There was also Cyclone Seroja, which wasn't necessarily covered by all international outlets, but this was a cyclone that flooded Indonesia, killing hundreds of people. And I don't want to leave out the Siberian wildfires that started burning in April and have continued up through October. And by the way, the carbon that was emitted in these fires is more than double that of 2020, more than double. There was also flooding in July in some of our major metropolitan areas. I myself can speak to this as a New Yorker. Many of our subways were flooded. People couldn't get in and out of the subways. In fact, they were just chest deep in water. And you probably saw the flooding in the subways of China. The newest subway line, subway number 5, where people were trapped in the subway up to their necks in the subway cars. Very frightening images. And of course, we can't leave out the wildfires in California. So those particular fires, there were over 8,000 individual fires, 2.5 million acres burned as of October. I can go on and on, but I will spare you the details. We'd be here all afternoon, wouldn't we, if we had to discuss every single climate event of 2021. So, yeah, it's really frightening. And with the, we're on course. The carbon emissions that we've emitted so far this year are much more than we had hoped. And I want to turn it over to Peter Carter, Dr. Peter Carter, and we'll cue that recording, please.
So I'm starting these slides with what I think is the single most important one. And this is from the August 2020 IPCC 6th Assessment Working Group 1. And here's the quote from their slide deck for authors. Unless there are immediate, rapid, and large-scale reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, limiting warming to 1.5 degrees C will be beyond reach. And in the press release and in another place, they said this may also apply to 2 degrees C. So the message for the COP26 is very simple. Everybody has to agree to put emissions into decline right away. This is a quote from a report which is getting a lot of media, and it will definitely be involved in the COP26. This is a report from the Climate Secretariat on their latest review of what all the national emissions targets add up to. And deplorably, they add up to an increase in greenhouse gas emissions by 2030, when, of course, we all know that those emissions must have decreased 50% from 2020. And Mrs. Patricia Espinosa made this quote: "Overshooting the temperature goals will lead to a destabilized world and endless suffering, especially among those who have contributed the least to the greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere." So this is a Climate Central slide. It's from the IPCC 6 Assessment Working Group 1. And it shows, and it's designed to show that we're practically at 1.5 degrees C, and that global surface heating temperature increase is accelerating even up to the very recent time. I gather that the COP26 will say at the end of the conference that we can still keep 1.5 degrees C alive. That's already been stated by the UK president of the COP. And that's an absolute lying nonsense. We left 1.5 degrees C behind quite some time ago. It's impossible now because the governments have delayed, prevaricated, and confused the negotiations, and delayed their rapid global emissions for so long that 1.5 degrees C, according to the AR6 Working Group 1 assessment, will hit us around 2030. So it's no time away at all.
Thank you so much. Those were sobering words by Dr. Carter. And Paul, I'm wondering if you can maybe perhaps sketch that out a bit for us.
Yes, thank you, Regina, and thanks again to everybody being here and watching online. We have to be careful here because when we talk about 1.5C or 2C, it's a meaningless number unless we refer to some baseline. And when those numbers were first discussed in climate conferences and by various international bodies, et cetera, those numbers were relative to the so-called beginning of the Industrial Revolution, which at the time those numbers were thrown about was 1750, the year 1750. Now we have a problem because everybody, media, scientists, everybody, when they talk about those numbers now, they're relative to a baseline that is not 1750. It's in fact the average temperature between 1880 and 1910. The problem is that the temperature went up between 1750 and that baseline of 1880 to 1910 by 0.2 to 0.3 degrees Celsius, depending on which study you look at. So when we talk about our temperature now being 1.17 or 1.2 above, we don't say the baseline, we just say, okay, we've reached 1.2, right? We need to add that 0.2 to 0.3 in order to compare it to the original temperature targets. And this is a point which is just lost in the woods. I mean, it's not talked about. So yeah, I mean, we could say that we could always stay under 1.5 if we now compare, what the temperature is now to 20 years ago or 50 years ago, right? I mean, if we always change the baseline, what's the point? Like, we're fooling ourselves. It's fraudulent, in fact. So why are we calling this the climate casino, right? I mean, a casino, you have the idea of luck, good luck, bad luck, randomness, the idea of winners and losers. There's very few winners at a casino. Most people are losers. And this is what's happening on our planet now. We're getting more and more losers and fewer winners. And if a city or a town or a region happens to have bad luck, people in that city, or you have bad luck in this climate casino, you can lose your house. You can lose your business. You can lose your town, in fact. You can lose the entire region. Maybe you'll get away with your life, maybe not. But the losses are enormous. And as the losses increase around the world, who's going to pay for rebuilding? And should we rebuild? If we're in a floodplain and we just keep rebuilding, it's like just throwing money into the ocean or throwing it away. And the reason why there's this random element is because the entire circulation patterns of the atmosphere have shifted because the jet streams have changed their nature, and we don't have a stable climate anymore. We have an unstable climate system, and within that climate system, the jet streams are slowing and getting wavier, and we're getting weather wilding and weirding and whip-lashing. And a perfect example of this whip-lashing is the US Mississippi River. For example, one year there's record flooding and boat traffic through the Mississippi, which is about 25% of the US economy of shipped goods, has to be curtailed. Then the very next year, there's record low levels of the Mississippi River. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers has to go and dynamite rocks on the floor, on the river bottom in order to have the water deep enough for ships to go through. And then what happens in the third year? There's record flooding exceeding even that of a few years previous. Right? So this is the idea of whip-lashing on a yearly time frame. We're also getting it on a monthly or daily time frame even. You know, think of a heat wave in North America, in Canada, in Ontario, for example, in March, where the temperature is huge, right? And then the temperature is very warm, all the buds come out, and then there's a killing frost for a week, and then that kills all of the buds and things have to start over. So the weather whip-lashing on all different time scales is really hitting us, and there's a random element. It's like we're at a climate casino.
Thank you so much for that, Paul. And I really like the metaphor that we're using here, the climate casino, because just to play this out a bit more, well, when you're in a casino, the house always wins, right? And my question is, who is the house in this instance? And I think we can rightly say that the primary house is a fossil fuel industry. Well, Exxon knew, and back in 1981, by its own scientists that it hired, that its product was going to warm the planet. So definitely the house always wins. And of course, these costs are externalized, right? We privatize the profits and socialize the losses. What does that mean? That we all pay. And I think it's really important what Dr. Carter said, that those who contribute the least to this catastrophe that we're currently living through and promulgating are the ones who are going to suffer the most. And this is unconscionable. It's amoral on a scale that's unimaginable as far as I'm concerned. I really want to emphasize that this moving goalpost, that the 1.5, Dr. Carter said, and he's an IPCC expert reviewer, it's not possible for us to stay within that. And I think that what we need to face is, what was really interesting is the panel before us talked about deep adaptation. And for many of us, that means absorbing the deep sadness that comes from mass extinction that we are perpetuating through living beings all across the globe. And I'd like to cue it up for the next portion to hear what more Dr. Carter has to add to this conversation. So thank you.
So this slide shows the abrupt accelerating increase in atmospheric CO2 concentration. It's a very dramatic slide. It's over 4,000 years, which is no time at all in terms of climate. And it shows how the CO2 concentration has gone right up, and it's already at 416 parts per million. This is, again, from that IPCC Working Group 1 authors' slide collection. This shows a similar thing with the abrupt increase in global temperature increase this time. And this, according to the report, is we are in the warmest period in at least 100,000 years. So our temperature increase is abruptly increasing. It is up to the present time accelerating, and that's the warmest period in the past 100,000 years. This is another quote from that Working Group 1 slide collection. It is indisputable that human activities are causing climate change, and here's the important bit, making extreme climate events, including heat waves, heavy rainfall, and droughts, more frequent and more severe. And of course, the report said that that will continue. They will continue to get more frequent and more severe. This is from the same report. The quote is that with every increment of global warming, these changes of extreme weather events will get larger in regional mean temperature, precipitation, and soil moisture. Soil moisture, of course, being drought. I showed this slide recently to a health congress out of Brazil, and look at South America. Terrible. This is at 2 degrees C. But also look at Mexico, the United States, and South Central Canada, and Western Europe, and China, and Southern Africa, and Australia. Those two little brown points there is where Australia's agriculture is. So this should be a pretty well-known slide. Well, the facts are well-known. This is from the IPCC 2018 1.5 degrees C report, and it shows CO2 emissions. The gray in the graph there is CO2 emissions from fossil fuels and industry. And it shows what the IPCC said, which is that those emissions had to be declining rapidly by 2020, and they had to have declined 50% by 2030 from 2020. That is our human survival prescription from the IPCC. This is just a simpler image, shortened up a little bit. Emissions must have been declining by 2020, dropped 50% by 2030, and then reach net zero carbon emissions. But that net zero carbon emissions is by zero fossil fuel production, which was specifically in the 1.5 degrees C report. Because of the horrible wood burning industry, we've got to make that zero carbon combustion. So the law of survival is zero carbon combustion by 2050. This shows this is one of the worst slides. This shows the unprecedented crime of our governments who are gathered in Glasgow for the COP26. They are still subsidizing fossil fuels. This is from the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, their publication very recently, October 2021, couldn't be more recent than that. And you can see from 2015 right up to 2021, and then IMF have projected this to 2025, that there is a massive world fossil fuel subsidies going on every year. And it is increasing, and it is projected to increase more. This is policies by our government that are killing the planet and destroying the future. And of course, the IMF said that this has now reached an absolute record of $5.9 trillion a year.
Wow, those numbers are truly amazing. And again, the House always wins. So I'm wondering, Paul, on that last slide that Peter showed us, the graph was amazing. He had the implicit versus the explicit subsidies to the fossil fuel industry. We saw the explicit direct subsidies going imperceptibly down, but the implicit going up. And I'm wondering if you can speak to that and maybe what does that mean?
Yes, the key metric for, are we doing anything on climate change is the CO2 levels in the atmosphere. And also, it mixes with the ocean, so the CO2 gets absorbed, some of it in the ocean. So that's a key metric. As long as those numbers are still going up, all of these climate conferences and policies are to naught. I mean, they're not working. The fossil fuel subsidies is essentially a negative price on carbon, right? I mean, you're giving companies free rein to do mining, to bring up, whether it be fracking or digging new oil wells or whatever, you're paying them to do exploration, to find new wells. And, you know, when we talk about a price on carbon, $10 or $50 or whatever, you know, so you need to take that $50 price on carbon and say, okay, well, if we're giving the company $70 and we've got a price of 50, well, that's negative 20. We're all the economic incentives of countries and politicians and corporations, you know, large entities, powers that be, are to encourage more fossil fuel development and usage. And as long as that happens, unless we come up with some magic bullet to suddenly remove vast amounts of CO2 from the atmosphere that far exceed what we're putting up there, you know, this is obviously, you know, a lost cause so far. So the key metric, and many of these fossil fuel subsidies are hidden. It's hard to actually get numbers on what they are until more recently, right? The accounting is better now, and it was to the advantage, of course, of fossil fuel companies that these numbers, the true numbers, were actually out of the public eye. Getting back to the climate casino, you know, you often hear of a weather event being maybe a 1 in 100 year or 1 in 1,000 year event. That unfortunately assumes a stable climate. When you have a stable climate, you can do the statistics on weather events and come up with numbers like that. Well, clearly now we're seeing, in quotes, a 1 in 1,000 year event happening 3 times within 10 years, or happening every other year, or, you know, the same thing for a 1 in 100 event. So clearly we're off the charts. We've destabilized the climate system. We've introduced a big element of randomness. You know, some places are, you know, hit much harder than others. Not everything is random. We know if you live on a floodplain, you're liable to be in trouble. You know, we know if you live near a coastal region, say in the US, the South, we're getting more intense storms because the seawater is much, much higher. You know, I mean, we're seeing just such bizarre things happening. Like there's in fact so many are happening that we're becoming kind of, you know, we have the ability in our mind to be surprised only once, right? And then if the same thing happens, we're a bit less surprised, and if the same thing happens, a bit less surprised. So we become kind of, you know, we reach a psychological situation where, you know, the extremes don't hit us emotionally or impact as much. Like, for example, the Arctic Circle, you know, vast regions of the Arctic Circle were over 30 degrees Celsius in the middle of the summer. Canada, we set temperature records in a place called Lytton, British Columbia, and it was very, very warm for 3 days in a row. The third day, it was 49.6 degrees Celsius in this town. And there was a spark the fourth day, and the town went up completely in smoke, completely destroyed. People in the Middle East living near water bodies, with the temperatures being so high of the water bodies, when those water temperatures, which push 34 degrees Celsius right now, when they reach 35, people are going to start dying on the coast because the wet bulb temperature will be 35 Celsius, 100% humidity. Human body, you know, you have heat stroke and heat exhaustion and heat stroke, and you can't be outside for more than about 6 or 7 or 8 hours, and your body breaks down. So areas like that will become uninhabitable to humans unless we wear cooling, like astronaut suits, or somehow cool our bodies by other means.
Well, that's a rather bleak assessment, Paul, so something to look forward to, I suppose. Not really. Peter was talking about this being the warmest period in the last 100,000 years, and you know, you often hear the argument that, you know, the planet's always been warming, it always goes through a warming cycle and a cooling cycle, and this is nothing different. However, I think what we can rightly say is that it is different. It was because of the rapidity of this warming. And you also spoke to, when you brought up the Mississippi, the only thing I could think of was how, if anyone here has visited New Orleans, if you're in the city and you want to see the Mississippi River, you actually have to walk up to see it because the city itself is below below sea level. So it's kind of amazing. So add that in, and the warming of the waters, as you said, which, which promotes thermal expansion. In other words, the water getting bigger. So then, again, this leads to the coastlines in trouble, in great trouble.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, basically the bottom line, I think, is that, we're just in a world of consequences of abrupt climate change right now. And there's, we can't consider normals or new normals, because as we're going, the human brain is geared to think in linear terms, and things are changing exponentially. And it's hard for our minds to wrap around how exponential change, how quickly it is. And the exponential changes and all the cascading feedback processes that are underway is undermining and will will take out a lot of our food supply in the near term, and lead to global famine, in my opinion. So this is where we're heading. So what are we going to do about it?
So going back to the casino, the house always wins, and that's a fossil fuel industry. Going back to Peter's chart, it also brought to mind, I know in the States, a lot of major universities, Yale, Columbia, MIT, are divesting their investments. And I'm wondering, this is a great move, but I'm wondering how much it will really affect anything, or is it just somewhat of a symbolic act on behalf of these various organizations that are doing this?
Yes, I mean, we obviously can't give up. We have to do everything that's humanly possible to stop this freight train, which has been set in motion. And we don't know the result, right? We don't know how successful we'll be. We don't know what we'll be able to attain, but that doesn't mean we don't go through the actions. Divesting from fossil fuels sends a strong message to people. And the idea that, we have 10 years, I mean, that's an absurd concept, right? It's absurd to say we've got 10 years or 5 years, or, we have to act now extremely strongly. I give the example, let's take the military budgets of the world, let's put them to renewables, looking at technologies to pull CO2 out of the atmosphere, to cool the planet, to take us off of this pathway that we're on, because it's not each other that is the threat. It's not other countries that are the threat. The main threat to your country and all countries of the world are abrupt climate change destabilizing our habitat.
Thank you so much for that, Paul. I want to thank everyone for being here, and just, if I have one key takeaway, the House always wins. Who is the House? The fossil fuel industry. And the saddest thing that we have to bear in mind is that those who are least responsible for this anthropogenic climate change are the ones who are going to suffer the most. We're all going to suffer to varying degrees, but some of us have more with which to insulate ourselves from the degree of suffering that we'll all face. And so that's a very important key takeaway. And I just want to thank you all for being here. And once again, we're the Climate Emergency Forum. And we would like to thank the Interfaith Center for Sustainable Development for allowing us to be here and for the opportunity, and also Buddhist Tzu Chi Association.
That's good.
So thank you all very much, and have a great day.